book that I heard, which I heard you read at your writer's space a couple of years back now, before the pandemic, and that's an essay called Trespass, and it has a refrain, "I am 4 months a mother." This phrase comes up repeatedly, and it's an essay that delves into breastfeeding, maternal love, both toward the child and from the previous generation, and questions about that, the difficulty that can sometimes come with it. So what I wanted to ask you, Courtney, is you tackle such big material. It's universal, but it's difficult, right? It's not just a saccharine story about maternal love. It shows how much work goes into it and how dangerous it can sometimes be. And I know you had huge success with the Story Prize, your story, Peanuts Aren't Nuts, and had people chomping at the bit, breaking down the door to get you to give them a novel, give you stories.
Yeah. That story was fiction, right?
That was a short story. It was fiction. And so where I'm going with my first question is, what made you do this hard thing of writing essays that touch the quick of it all? Why did you do the hard thing? Which is also, by the way, not always the most remunerative thing in the marketplace.
At all.
You crazy person.
I know, what's wrong with me? So I have a few answers. The first is that I was working on, and I'm still working on fiction at the time, but at the time that I became a mom. But I found motherhood to be so intense and complicated and wonderful and challenging and all those things, and needed to sort out some clarity, or needed to gain some clarity through various singular experiences, and then sort of the new role I was filling in a larger way. And the only way I could figure to do that was through writing, trained as a writer, and through nonfiction, because I was seeking real-time clarity. And I think for anyone who becomes a parent, it's kind of impossible not to think about how you were parented. Either a role you wish to emulate, a role you wish to push against, some combination therein, but I just had a lot of profound questions and no answers, and so the experience that I write about in Trespass, which involves breastfeeding, involves my 4-month-old son, involves my mother, that was, something that felt dramatic and intense that happened, and it just sort of coagulated in my head, non-fictionally, and so I needed to kind of work my way through it on the page. But you're right that, fiction is sort of my native language and my first calling. And this book sort of came together accidentally, in that I just kept having these experiences that I wanted to gain clarity on or write my way through. And actually a friend of mine taught some of these essays to his classes. They were publishing in literary journals, and before I visited his class, I reread them to remember what the hell I had written, and discovered that there were some themes in common among them, and that they shared themes in common with others that I was working on. I sort of thought of it as something I was doing on the side, but when I read them cohesively, collectively, it was quite clear that there was a book happening.
It's remarkable how these essays range over many topics, but do cohere so closely. The themes of motherhood and love and forgiveness and pain and guilt. So many issues that are there, no matter what we're talking about, whether it's a bat mitzvah or a friend who becomes a surrogate for another family's child. But anyway, I wanted to go back to this question of nonfiction for one more moment, because there are so many writers who have gone in the direction of autofiction recently. Did you ever consider...
Should we define what that is?
Yeah, so autofiction maybe... do you want to talk about what you think it is and why you didn't go there, maybe that would be good. So
yeah, gosh, maybe I should have. Autofiction is, it's fiction that's expressly based on a writer's autobiography, but departs from it enough that it qualifies as fiction. So I think it, causes a reader to try to tease apart what's true and what may not be true, but there's it's really on trend now, autofictional work.
yeah, so I think for generations people have been doing that work. People
Yes.
used to call it the autobiographical novel, and that was more popular. And then there was a sort of a sea change, and everybody who'd written an autobiographical novel then wrote a memoir with the exact same story, and it became an even bigger bestseller if it was. And so, people like to see the same thing again. It's like a series or something. But these days we call it autofiction, or a lot of people do.
Yeah.
Well, why didn't you go there?
So, I don't have a clear answer except to say that it was important to me as a rabid consumer of books and texts to find literature that in some ways touched the experiences I was having. And I hoped, I think, in my most generous moment, that this book could do something like that for a reader. And I think fiction can certainly inspire empathy. That's one of the reasons I read it and write it. But it felt very important that a lot of these complications be clearly true.
Yeah, so the story Holy Body is really written in a second person point of view, so it's addressed to the self as you. And it really brought empathy out in me. I felt that that command from Courtney's authorial voice really brought me into the experience as though they weren't my own. So you triggered that, and I thought that was masterful. Talk a little bit about how much you have chosen to reveal the difficult truths in relationships. You say some honest things about your family members, your mother, your children, that might not be easy to share. A lot of people say, I can only write this book when my mother dies, or I could never write this because my children might read it. You've done some things which are a little daring in terms of that. You've said some things which I can imagine are required some conversations with family members. So what do you?
Yeah, it's
did
complicated.
Did you consider masking the truth, or did you mask the truth?
So, again, I have so many ways to think about this question and so many answers. First thing I'll say is that even though this is a memoir, it's only revealing a sliver of my life. And there's the sort of assumption that that when a reader hears the phrase memoir, or the word memoir rather, that it's some kind of tell-all. But this is very carefully curated, which isn't to say the stories and the details are untrue. They're all true. But I made deliberate, selective choices about what I felt comfortable discussing and what I didn't. And some of, the most challenging parts of my life and my family's life is not in here, which isn't to say also that the choices of what I included didn't require some difficult conversations. When it came to my children, and I think different authors have different feelings about this, especially if they're writing nonfiction and writing about their families, I think my children are largely under the age of 5 in this book. So I felt like they're still like little meatloafs, and I was still in charge of them, and still, they couldn't control their bodily function. I just felt like, maybe that's an okay choice. And when they're older now, my oldest son is 10, my youngest son is 7, I wrote one essay after this book came out that featured them, which was pretty visible. It was in the New York Times, and I actually asked their permission. Though I don't know what I would have done had they said no. The Times already said yes.